After years of severe drought, a winter of unprecedented snow and rainfall has left much of California dealing with flooding and other environmental hazards to manage. With a record-breaking snowpack that was 233% greater than a typical year, the impacts of the heavy precipitation on California's ecosystems have been significant and often unpredictable. This was certainly the case for San Joaquin Valley in California, where a massive lake 4 times the size of Lake Tahoe that disappeared nearly a century ago has suddenly returned to life. Located roughly halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco in California, the San Joaquin Valley is known today for producing much of the world's almonds, pistachios, milk, and fruit. There is primarily desert surrounding the farmland in San Joaquin Valley today. However, prior to the 20th century, the region was a lush and biodiverse habitat that was home to trees, wetlands, and a huge lake that created the fertile land that is so conducive to growing the agricultural products that the San Joaquin Valley in California is known for. So why did Americans drain a lake that, at its prime, was comparable in size to the Great Salt Lake in Utah? And how did a lake of that scale disappear in less than half a century? For thousands of years, the San Joaquin Valley was home to Tulare Lake, once the largest body of water west of the Mississippi River. In the late 1800s, humans began to drain Tulare Lake, with the lake completely disappearing by the mid-20th century. Then, in early 2023, following months of severe snow and heavy rainfall, and with the subsequent snowmelt, Central California's Tulare Basin began to once again fill with water, with the lake suddenly reappearing 150 years after the basin had dried up. The magnitude of Tulare Lake's return remains to be seen. Already, the lake has returned to cover an area of 30 square miles. The size could increase to over 200 square miles in the near future, which would largely disrupt the significant farming industry present in the Tulare Basin. During periods of high water in the past, Tulare Lake was huge and covered an area of up to 600 square miles, sometimes reaching as much as 790 square miles. In comparison, Lake Tahoe spans just 191 square miles, while Los Angeles covers an area of just over 500 square miles, so Lake Tulare was truly enormous. But why did Americans drain the massive lake to begin with? And why, after 100 years of being gone, has Tulare Lake suddenly resurfaced? It all began millions of years ago. Yes, millions. When the Central Valley region was formed by geographical events that shaped an immense basin between the Sierra and Coastal Range mountains. You see, about 65 million years ago, the Pacific Ocean began to intermittently flood the Central Valley of California. As a result of these floods, the area became a bay that opened to the south. However, around 2 million years ago, movement of the coastal ranges along the San Andreas Fault and sediment deposits from flooding of the area are thought to have caused the separation of the Central Valley from the ocean. As a result, the Central Valley area was no longer a bay, and it began to alternate between draining and filling with water. This draining and filling, along with glacial melt in the area, transformed the saltwater remnants of the bay into a massive freshwater lake. The lake's formation took place during the Pleistocene epoch, an era marked by ice ages and the coexistence of saber-toothed cats, longhorn bison, giant ground sloths, birds boasting 25-foot wingspans, and even early humans. Mammoths quenched their thirst at the lake's shores, while Tule elk grazed in the surrounding marshlands. Lake Corcoran, which is sometimes also referred to as Lake Clyde, was the last of what are known as the Central Valley's Great Lakes, and formed nearly 700,000 years ago. The lake covered much of the Central Valley of California, spanning as much as 19,000 square miles of surface area. This is comparable in size to Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes on the East Coast and the 5th largest lake in the United States. Lake Corcoran was not only immense, but also instrumental in shaping the geography and ecosystem of Central California and surrounding areas. The lake produced Corcoran clay, which is prevalent in the Central Valley and now forms an aquifer layer that stores groundwater. Additionally, Lake Corcoran influenced sedimentation off the coast of California, a process that involves depositing rocks, clay, and other sediments, giving insights into the area's geological history. Research on clay deposits linked to the lake's sedimentation supports the belief that Lake Corcoran existed for 50,000 to 100,000 years. The lake's size fluctuated with the seasons, filling and draining in cycles. Evaporation from the lake spurred rainfall in nearby mountain ranges, such as the Sierra Nevadas and the Basin and Province Range. Consequently, Lake Corcoran contributed to the formation of numerous large pluvial lakes in Nevada. Pluvial lakes meaning lakes formed by rainfall. Before the lake's outlet to San Francisco Bay emerged 600,000 years ago, it drained into Monterey Bay via the Salinas River. Occasionally, the lake would overflow, spreading its mineral-rich, glacier-fed waters to neighboring regions through rivers and outlets. These overflows and drainage distributed nutrient-rich waters across the Central Valley, fostering fertile soil and diverse habitats, including wetlands, grasslands, and marshes. However, around 400,000 years ago, the Earth's crust shifted, elevating the Central Valley's land and lowering the San Francisco Bay Area. Portions of the lake collided with coastal mountains, causing boulders, rushing water, and other sediments to carve out deep channels and initiate the formation of the San Francisco Bay. Then, Lake Corcoran disappeared, never to return again. Following the vanishing of Lake Corcoran, 3 sizable lakes emerged in the valley: Buena Vista Lake, Kern Lake, and Tulare Lake. Tulare Lake was located in the Tulare Basin, an expansive, predominantly flat and arid area. For millennia after Lake Corcoran's disappearance, these successor lakes sustained life in the Central Valley's grasslands, wetlands, prairies, woodlands, riparian forests, and Tule grass marshes. Tulare Lake fostered a resilient and diverse habitat where birds, plants, fish, and other species thrived together for many years. The lake's name originated from the giant sedge plant known as tule, which grew in the freshwater marshes surrounding the lake. Tule is a native grass that serves as a weather buffer, reduces erosion, and encourages the growth of other plant species. For centuries, the lake functioned as a floodplain for water originating from surrounding mountain ranges, including the Sierra Nevada, transverse ranges, and coast ranges. Rivers, other lakes, and runoff all contributed water to the immense Tulare Lake. The Kings River supplied the majority of water to the basin, while precipitation and runoff from the Sierra Nevada and other surrounding mountain ranges also added to the lake's vast size. Simultaneously, runoff from the neighboring Kern and Buena Vista lakes followed north into the Buena Vista Slough and then into Tulare Lake through a natural sand ridge. All these sources provided the lake with an ample supply of clean fresh water, enabling the formation and growth of such an expansive lake. In its prime, Tulare Lake spanned a vast expanse of California's Central Valley. With an average depth of 20 to 30 feet, Tulare Lake sometimes covered nearly 800 square miles, and some research indicates that during seasons of heavy rain and snowmelt, the lake's size may have peaked over 1,000 square miles. In 1858, the lake measured an impressive 80 miles in length, which means that had they existed back then, California towns like Corcoran and Stratford would have been submerged 25 feet beneath Tulare Lake's surface. However, this considerable size was maintained only until 1878, and less than 2 decades later, it was gone entirely. For millennia, Tulare Lake was among the largest bodies of water in North America, particularly west of the Mississippi River. But what caused this enormous and biodiverse lake to vanish so abruptly? Approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, the first human inhabitants of the Tulare Lake Basin migrated to the area. These Native Americans settled near the lake, taking advantage of its rich wildlife, water resources, and plant life for sustenance. For millennia, local tribes thrived around the lake and its tributaries, fishing in the foothills and valleys of the nearby mountain, as well as along Southern California's coast. The arrival of the Spanish in the San Joaquin Valley, also known as Valle de los Tulares, or the Valley of the Tule Grass, in the early 19th century profoundly disrupted the local people's ways of life. Diseases brought by the Spanish devastated the native tribes as Lieutenant Gabriel Moraga and his fellow Spanish army officers sought locations to evangelize the indigenous population in California around 1808. During this mission, Moraga discovered a small creek which he named San Joaquin, after Jesus' father and Mary's father in the Bible, as well as in honor of his own father who had previously explored the region. Eventually, the entire area became known as the San Joaquin Valley. Soon after Moraga's evangelizing mission began, the Spanish presence expanded in North America, spanning from present-day Mexico to the United States. This growth, driven primarily by violence and conquest, saw a significant increase in the Spanish population. The Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 resulted in the annexation of present-day United States territories. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted the United States, California, and Mexico's other northern states for $10 million, equivalent to over $350 million today when adjusted for inflation. For much of Tulare Lake's existence under colonial forces, the region experienced alternating periods of drought and flooding. Periods of flooding would turn the whole landscape of Central Valley into expansive water, with wetlands bordered by an otherwise arid landscape. The flooding provided nutrients and minerals to the soil, creating fertile farmland for farmers. At the same time, the seemingly endless supply of clean fresh water was valued for its potential for agriculture and irrigation. Little did they know that supply would soon be depleted by the selfish and careless actions of a small group of farmers. As recently as 150 years ago, Tulare Lake was home to abundant wildlife that coexisted with fishermen, tourists, turtle hunters, and others who came to its shores. Boats, including reed rafts, barges, and sailboats, sailed its shallow waters. These boats carried hogs and cattle, oil pipes, goods for trade, and fishermen, along with others visiting the lake. However, increased development and agriculture in the area began to place extreme pressure on the lake, taking a toll that would forever change Tulare Lake in the San Joaquin Valley. During the mid-1800s, the complex water system of the Tulare Basin started to be converted into what is sometimes called a lake and slough wetland, or shallow, swampy wetland area filled with backwater and vegetation. From 1854 to 1872, first-hand accounts report the lake changed very little. However, around the start of the 1870s, European settlers began building canals, dams, and reservoirs, and diverting water upstream from the lake toward their farmlands in order to irrigate their crops. By diverting water for irrigation upstream from Tulare Lake, a booming agricultural industry cut off Tulare Lake from its source waters, or the rivers and other water systems that fed the lake, which caused the lake to shrink. Within less than 50 years of the start of the widespread irrigation in the Central Valley, Tulare Lake totally dried up for the first time in its long history. As Tulare Lake started to diminish, European settlers staked claim on the newly emerged farmland within the Tulare Basin, constructing infrastructure and altering waterways to better manage flooding and water flow in and around the lake. The lake's size rapidly decreased as the lake bed was transformed into farmland through the erection of levees, embankments designed to prevent water overflows. With the expansion of farming and agriculture in the Tulare Basin as the lake receded, the region gained a reputation for its plentiful crops. Today, the area is renowned for producing tomatoes, grains, fruits, nuts, milk, cotton, safflower, and other agricultural products. Tulare Lake's disappearance was visible and quick, occurring in less than half a century. The lake's boundaries steadily shrank, which experts of the era observed to have accelerated after the initial 3 years of irrigation farming in the San Joaquin Valley. By 1875, the southern end of the lake had significantly contracted to a mere mile in width. In the subsequent 5 years from 1875 to 1880, the lake continued to diminish in size. By 1888, Tulare Lake had become almost entirely circular, having shrunk to around 220 square miles despite once being 3 or 4 times larger, covering an area of 600 to 800 square miles. By 1895, Tulare Lake had vanished completely. In the mid-19th century, for the first time in millennia, the ancient lakes of California's Central Valley ceased to exist entirely. Approximately 95% of the valley's wetlands disappeared due to the demands of farming irrigation during the 19th and 20th centuries. Now these once biodiverse wetlands have transformed into semi-arid deserts in many areas. The San Joaquin River watershed, previously connected to the Tulare Lake Basin, covers between 2/3 and 3/4 of Northern California's land, but only collects 1/4 to 1/3 of the region's precipitation, as irrigation technologies divert water for agricultural use. In the past, Tulare Lake sometimes overflowed into the river during filling periods, providing abundant water flow. The Central Valley's agricultural history has involved major exports of crops associated with Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisine, which thrive year-round in the region. Additionally, a thriving ranching and dairy industry exists in the area. However, the farmland that was once home to Tulare Lake is now being encroached upon as urban sprawl contributes to the region's water demand. Between 1990 and 2004, the Central Valley lost over 70,000 acres of farmland as a result of development related to urban sprawl. And this competition over groundwater has put a massive strain on the ecological and water systems in the San Joaquin Valley region. In 1947, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers initiated the construction of Pine Flat Dam, which was completed in 1954. Although Pine Flat Dam offered improved flood control, irrigation opportunities, and crop diversification, its impact on local wetland habitats and the aquifer storing groundwater was disastrous. The dam significantly contributed to the loss of wetlands and the aquifer in the San Joaquin Valley, further exacerbating the water systems issues in the Tulare Basin. At the same time, the intense demand for groundwater for both irrigation and drinking water in the Central Valley has begun to take a severe toll on the natural environment that extends far beyond the disappearance of Tulare Lake. For one, studies show that some land in the San Joaquin Valley of California has been shrinking at a rate as much as a foot a year as a result of the overuse of groundwater in the region. For centuries, farmers and inhabitants of the region have overpumped the aquifer layer under the earth that is called Corcoran clay. The Corcoran clay was left behind by Lake Corcoran hundreds of thousands of years ago. As a result, the clay becomes unable to withstand the weight of the land above it and is compacted, which makes it incapable of storing water ever again. In other words, the careless extraction of water in the Central Valley region not only caused Tulare Lake to disappear, but also is literally causing the earth to sink and is preventing water from ever sustainably being stored in the region ever again. Meanwhile, especially during the early 20th century, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta suffered from salinity intrusion, which means that saltwater from the San Francisco Bay would flow into the delta and the Suisun Bay during high tide. Salinity intrusion meant that fresh water in the associated water systems could be contaminated with saltwater from the ocean, making the water unusable for crops and agricultural purposes, as well as drinking water. The Tulare Lake bed remained dry for most of the 20th century, but in recent months, Tulare Lake has made an unexpected return. Over the years, since the lake's disappearance, the Tulare Basin has occasionally flooded during extremely wet years and during periods of abundant snowpack on the Sierra Nevada mountains. Prior to 2023, the Tulare Lake bed last flooded in 1969, 1983, and 1997. In 1983, the flooding brought the waters of a returned Tulare Lake all the way to the city limits of Corcoran. Back then, there was 1 million acre-foot of water that flowed into the Tulare Basin. For reference, 1 acre-foot is equivalent to a foot of water over an acre of land. As a result of such a massive quantity of snowmelt and precipitation, the flooding in 1983 caused 82,000 acres to be submerged in water, and researchers expect to see similar rates of flooding this year. Normally, any influx of water in the Tulare Basin is managed through evaporation ponds, pumps, and levees, but the sheer volume of runoff and precipitation is pushing the capacity of these systems. Because there's so much snow in the Sierras, it's expected to take a very long time to fully melt and reach the Tulare Basin. Already, levees have begun to break, which has flooded much farmland and has left many farmers to take flood control and protection of their crops into their own hands. It is expected that levees will continue to break, and there is already sustained high water that is pushing against the already saturated levees. The San Joaquin Valley experienced a severe drought for almost a decade, making this year's heavy rain and snow a surprise. Consequently, an ecosystem unprepared to absorb significant precipitation has faced substantial runoff and flooding. The sinking land and diminished aquifers hindered the storage of water as groundwater, creating impermeable surfaces susceptible to standing water and flooding. With Tulare Lake's disappearance, there's no natural runoff drainage, and relocating the water is challenging. Moreover, the Kings River's unpredictability may exacerbate the lakebed flooding, with warmer weather approaching. As of March 2023, over 10 atmospheric rivers have occurred in the San Joaquin Valley in recent months, demonstrating the relentless precipitation in the region this winter. But these atmospheric rivers and a winter of heavy precipitation have contributed to flooding and thus the return of Tulare Lake in San Joaquin Valley. At present, Tulare Lake's return has posed a massive threat to thousands of people and a way of life in San Joaquin Valley that first emerged after the lake's disappearance. Already the lake is larger than all but one of California's reservoirs and could remain that size for at least 2 years. The flooding is expected to cause billions of dollars worth of economic damage and displace thousands of local residents and farm workers, many of whom will be undocumented immigrants who are unable to obtain unemployment or government support in response to the floods. Estimates suggest that the flooding of Tulare Basin will likely be a massive blow to the $2 billion agricultural industry in Kings County, which has a population of 152,000. In early 2023, the San Joaquin Valley experienced flooding as snowmelt and heavy precipitation throughout the winter filled the Tulare Basin, leaving California officials uncertain about the extent of flooding and the appropriate response. In the neighboring mountains, a more than 50-foot deep snowpack, the largest snowpack in 75 years, awaited warmer weather that would eventually lead to melting and runoff in the Tulare Basin. The question remained of how fast the snowpack would melt, so the state of California geared up to address the flooding with over 700 people assigned to help with the emergency response in Tulare County alone. In Tulare County, the flooding has damaged more than 900 structures so far. Continued flooding poses a serious risk for farmers and farmhands, as well as members of rural communities that line the basin. Teams from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention have also been on site to prepare for potential disasters. Currently, there have already been many communities that have been evacuated, and hundreds of homes and farms have been devastated. At the same time, cattle raised for dairy have been moved to elevated grounds by the tens of thousands, while farmers have to decide whether to relocate or slaughter millions of chickens. Looking ahead, collaboration between the state of California, local towns, and residents aims to protect homes, farms, and communities. However, preventing the return of Tulare Lake is difficult, if not impossible. The lake serves as a stark example of how nature's focus and climate change can have disastrous effects in areas where human intervention has mismanaged natural environments. Decisions made centuries ago continue to impact people today, and these consequences will likely persist until humans prioritize the protection and cultivation of land over its depletion and exploitation. A century and a half ago, a group of self-serving settlers disrupted a thriving ecosystem that had existed for millennia, leading to the disappearance of Tulare Lake. In the process, they displaced and decimated local indigenous populations, while also annihilating much of the lake's rich biodiversity. By severing the connection between the lake and its source waters, these early inhabitants of the San Joaquin Valley set in motion the lake's eventual disappearance and its destructive resurgence, with repercussions still felt today. Tulare Lake, once the largest lake west of the Mississippi River, is now returning, engulfing the very farms that contributed to its decline long ago. The future of the lake remains uncertain, but the economic and infrastructural devastation resulting from heavy rainfall and snowmelt in the San Joaquin Valley is unmistakable. As communities reconstruct and adjust to the lake's return, it is essential to learn from and never forget the lessons imparted by Tulare Lake's dynamic